You know, one thing I hear quite often is the statement that these videos are favored because of their digestible nature, with nuggets of information being handed out inside of a humorous and casual packaging. I tend to prefer sharing lesser-known stories of old, or those long-term series of events that have a lasting impact on things that can be observed even today. But in doing so, I often will find myself overlooking some of the gems of the modern day. Perhaps also because with a lot of the modern gems, they're very much out of my reach as a starving content creator. With all that said, I think we can all agree that a video on a Ninja H2 is probably long overdue. But that's the thing. Looking to the past gave me some context of the failures of the boosted bikes of the 1980s. It also gave me the context of why this bike will come from the mad lad Kawasaki of all people. Everything just makes so much more sense, and I would argue that I can appreciate the existence of this bike way more now. I just can't get over the fact that it's been 7 years. See, back when the Ninja H2 and the H2R was on its way out in 2015, I was just beginning getting into motorcycles, and this thing was just another crazy fast superbike. But back then my dream bike was the 0304 Ninja 636, a bike that I haven't paid any mind to in years. And back then, yeah, that was my ideal signature bike. So leader bikes weren't really something that I cared much for at the time. But anyway, the Ninja H2 is one of those bikes that's a culmination of resources, a mission statement, and past precedent. It's one of those bikes that exists due to a perfect storm of all of these factors. And when you consider the name Ninja H2 alone, you must tie the bike back to two things: the well-established family of sport motorcycles under the Ninja name, and the infamous H2 of the 1970s. You already know the staple of sport bikes under the Ninja name, and thus you know how this bike fits in. But some of you may not know of the H2 from the model years 1972 to 1975. That bike was widely considered to be the fastest accelerating and the most exhilarating production motorcycle at the time, bar none. The bike achieved its reputation through its 750cc two-stroke triple-cylinder engine that produced 74 horsepower. It was the ultimate in the line of air-cooled three-cylinder two-stroke motorcycles produced by Kawasaki starting in 1968. It was a direct successor to the 500cc Kawasaki H1. Now granted, 74 horsepower might not seem like that much today. I mean, you get that out of an FCO 7 these days, but it's the way in which the power came on out of nowhere once you hit 4,000 RPM. And some guys would throw expansion chambers and all that on them for more power, making them really popular for racing. Power band was so aggressive that it would throw up the front wheel and upset the rather primitive chassis. So yeah, the engine pretty much outperformed everything else on the bike, which led to it having a reputation of being a fun ride at best and a widowmaker at worst. See, back then you didn't have to worry much about noise and air pollution, but nowadays I can certainly admit that this blue smoke screen is a bit excessive. This bike was pretty much like nothing that anyone had ever really seen before, and the reputation that it garnered had Kawasaki hooked on creating these fast, no-holds-barred motorcycles, and then still managing to find a way to one-up themselves on them. With the popularity of the CB750 since 1969, many manufacturers had also put out their own 750 class bike as that became a trend, but the approach that Kawasaki took was to make something with exhilarating acceleration, torque, and speed at the forefront to stand out from the crowd. So surely you now understand why the nameplate of the H2 made its way from an old smoky and two-strokey standard onto this modern four-stroke race bike. The mission was the same: to disrupt an established class with something offering acceleration feeling like nothing else. But this is neither the 70s nor is it the 90s. And what I mean by that is, in the 70s you don't have to worry about shit when it comes to engineering vehicles as far as pollution goes. But nowadays you have to make sure your vehicle can meet a bunch of different laws in different markets. Two strokes are now off the table. I mean, it has to be quiet out of the box. It can only emit soap bubbles out the back. In the 90s, if you were going something super fast, it had to be over a liter and it had to be thick. Granted, there's still a market for those bikes as drag bikes, as fast and stable cruisers, and as great sport tourers, which is why those bikes like the ZX14 and the Busa are still around. The rather logical progression would be to spiritually continue the speed wars, and create some ungodly version of the ZX14. Hell, dude, just make it a ZX15. No. 16. But no, not entirely necessary, because those guys can simply take the big girls and boost them as is, and then they'll absolutely own the drag strips and the highways, regardless of what Kawasaki could come up with, because there's some bloke who's gonna throw some forged bits, a turbo, a stretch kit, and some alcohol, and smoke whatever Kawasaki comes up with. Kawasaki would have to think about those pesky emissions laws. So Kawasaki went for the leader bike market, as it represents the standard of high performance, of balance, and of development. The over leader class, not including the triples and the twins from you-know-who, obviously has very little focus focus on going around the track. And these days, the 600 class is essentially a collective fever dream we're slowly forgetting as we go about our day. As I've said before, technology has eclipsed raw displacement, and thus this bike would be jam-packed with some serious engineering. While studying to write this essay, I actually learned just how long this bike was in the making, or at least the idea of this bike. Let me explain, because I kind of went nerd mode over this, because this actually predates my bike life, but it's finally recent enough history that I was sentient during it. See, Kawasaki had been supercharging this goofy-ass jet ski since the late aughts, and it's pretty damn cool. The point is that Kawasaki had experienced supercharging relatively compact 4-cylinders already. And in 2011, at least 4 new patent documents had revealed that Kawasaki was working on a supercharged 4-cylinder motorcycle. But the press had interpreted it as a, quote, potential replacement for the ZX14, as a 2-wheeled motor vehicle with supercharger. Naturally, journalists got a hold of this news and ran with it, talking about a ZX15, which made me laugh because I made that joke earlier before we even know about this. In these documents, the crank-driven supercharger is located behind the cylinders and underneath the intake. Fast forward from 2011 to 2013, and Kawasaki actually showed off a 1000cc inline 4 supercharged engine just by itself at the Tokyo Motor Show, which Kawasaki claimed to be the first supercharger designed by a motorcycle manufacturer. Not the first supercharger on a bike, but you gotta spin it a little bit. The bike that was rumored to be in the making since 2009 was now confirmed to at least be somewhat existent. But the assumptions, while logical, that the bike would be a ZX14 successor were totally wrong. And Kawasaki would make that known in late 2014 at several bike shows.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, and welcome all to Orlando and our sharing of some exciting products. And I'm sorry if I'm getting in the way, because I know that's why you guys came, and I've been told to get away from everyone's shot. So we understand that it is a true honor to be able to share what has been such a talked about product. We're absolutely honored that you are all here. So without further ado, based on the 30th anniversary of the Ninja, and here in North America for the very first time, allow me to formally present the Kawasaki Ninja H2R. So the question is, why did Kawasaki build the H2? Well, simply to offer riders an intense acceleration that they never have experienced before, truly. And the result, we truly think, you'll agree, is the first true hyperbike. So we should also point out the design of the H2R was also purely functional. That's what really matters at the end of the day. It's more than just something that's for show. And the Ninja H2R is a technological marvel. I mean, honestly, I'm gonna stop for a quick second. It is truly amazing this bike actually exists. So again, we're very honored and proud. I mean, we've just been soaking it in ourselves that it actually exists. So delivering performance that truly many thought was impossible. Case in point, 300 horsepower, that's right, 300 horsepower. And then the other part, which is really cool for the history of the brand, is the name in tribute to the original king of the streets, the classic 1972 H2. And some of you may recall out there the intense acceleration that that bike had, and it's burnt in your memories, and we really feel that this bike is going to do the same. And then what's is really fun, the street legal H2 will be released at EICMA, and will be sold through the Kawasaki dealer network, so it's for real. And all the details that you've been waiting for, and I know you all have been patient for that, will be provided at the EICMA show on November 4th. Well, wrapping up here, the world's first and most powerful hyperbike, the supercharged Kawasaki Ninja H2R. We believe it's built beyond belief. Thank you.
One thing to really consider is the fact that between H2 and H2R, the track-only H2R was actually the first one to be announced, with the street-legal H2 being kind of sidelined a little bit later. Of course, you're going to want to show the better one first to gain the massive hype that this bike got, and naturally it's going to be easier to develop the better model and then scale it down from there. But the issue is that the street-legal model is going to be the one that sells. But in any case, I was always curious as to which one was the definitive model, and that's clearly the H2R. So yeah, the H2R was revealed in both Europe in September 2014 and America in October, and then the street legal H2 was revealed at EICMA in Italy in November.
All right, this could be the star of EICMA 2014, the long teased Kawasaki H2, the street bike, but supercharged, street legal motorcycle. This is something really special. High-end Kawasaki stuff, fully adjustable suspension, single-sided swing arm, got this beautiful chrome black paint on it, Oline steering damper.
Alright, first impressions. H2R looks way better than the H2, undeniably, because it's unyielding in its design. When you look at it dead on, the bike looks very Asian, which is a good thing. It almost looks like a mythical creature. When you look at the carbon weave as skin texture and those graphics, those green graphics as whiskers, you start to get dragon vibes. Well, at least I do. With the street legal version, you gotta fit mirrors and lights and all that somewhere. You gotta change up the muffler to this. All these little things that were clearly not the original sort of ideas of design, you know? So with that even said, I can't tell if the H2R is the most beautiful bike ever made, or if it's just a messy looking exercise of function over form, because from some angles, with certain lighting, holy fucking shit. And with others, well, maybe they should have outsourced the design. Don't get me wrong, any angle and any day of the week you look at this is gonna have more curb appeal than pretty much anything out there. I should note that one journalist by the name of Kevin Cameron, he's actually pretty well known, had the right idea for the possible applications of a supercharger early on by not assuming that it would be applied to a ZX14 type bike, but perhaps a 600 or a leader bike. He gave possible boost numbers and correlating horsepower figures for all three classes. It wasn't perfect, but he did know what was realistic for street use, you know, which sort of reflects how Kawasaki had to put out a street and a track version. So he had the right idea. Alright, let's talk specs. The hand-built H2R was of course packing its signature supercharged 4 that put out a claimed 310 horsepower or 326 with ram air at actual high speed at 14,000 RPM. That was alongside a max torque figure of 165 Newton meters or 121.7 pound-feet. The H2R weighed in at 476 pounds wet or 216 kilograms. If you remember, this bike was most often compared to the BMW S1000RR, which produced just about 200 horsepower. In fact, the road legal H2 made about the same peak horsepower as the S1000RR, which left many concerned because why? But that's something I really want to get back to later. The H2R weighed only 26 more pounds than the 450-pound S1000RR. So to be fair, that would be in the stock form for the BMW, and with some bolt-ons, you could easily widen that gap. You know, I don't reckon the H2R can get much lighter than it is because it's already spec'd out. The S1000RR was obviously not winning on torque values, having a max value of 113 Newton meters or 83.3 pound-feet. And there lies the reason for this bike's existence. I think most experienced bikers know that torque is the actual figure of fun. Not necessarily horsepower or top speed. Well, I guess top speed is debatable because some of y'all are kind of insane. But torque and acceleration is why I always find myself gearing my bikes so low that they're all but useless on the highway. H2R has insane torque with insane horsepower and insane top speed. It has everything. H2R is graced with the Kawasaki River mark, which dates back to the 1870s for the company. Kawasaki wasn't working in the world of motorcycles back then. They were actually a company specializing in ships and offshore structures. Since then, throughout the years, they've developed a presence in several different fields under the overarching name of Kawasaki Heavy Industries. This is relevant because Kawasaki was able to pull resources from its gas and turbine and aerospace branches, for example, to help the motorcycle division create this Mach. How? Well, the turbine branch naturally helped produce the supercharger. It's funny because at first Kawasaki actually tried to outsource the development and the manufacture of the supercharger to several companies, but each and every single one saw the specifications that Kawasaki wanted and told them that it couldn't be done. Impossible. No. With a record like that of doing the quote impossible, you can understand why this bike dons the insignia once flown by these grand ships. The bike is a product of the conglomerate as a whole. Okay, so while we're here, let's actually talk about the supercharger. It's developed entirely in-house by a few divisions of KHI and is optimized to be used in the chassis of a motorcycle. For example, Kawasaki was adamant about using a design that did not need an intercooler system, as it would be too bulky and heavy, despite the very high output expectations of the entire system. The supercharger is driven by the crankshaft through a series of gears known as the step-up gear set and a chain, as well as the very important planetary gear, which was actually inspired by technology found in planes, the expertise of the aerospace division of KHI. The combination of the gears and chain creates a ratio that allows the 70mm impeller to spin at 130,000 RPM when the engine itself is turning at 14,000 RPM. It is conventionally known as a centrifugal supercharger, which may confuse the uninitiated as they do tend to physically look like a turbo. The centrifugal supercharger is best suited here compared to the other types of supers because they're generally better at generating less heat with their boost, lending itself to Kawasaki's goal of running a setup void of an intercooler. Even though this is a plus, there's a downside in the fact that you need a fair amount of rotational speed in the impeller to produce torque at the low end, similar to a turbocharger. This is where Kawasaki's step-up and planetary gear system comes in, allowing the supercharger to spin at an optimal rate no matter the RPM. Of course, the system is well lubricated and the impeller is spinning on ceramic ball bearings. Air is pulled in from the ram air tube at the front of the bike, and around the left side into the impeller. From there, it's fed into the aluminum airbox, which can't be the typical plastic because it would break from all the pressure. For some reason, it's been really hard to find the boost figure because it seems like no one cares or no one knows, and all that comes up is the figure for the H2, which is 20.5 psi. Now, from what I could tell, the H2R is running 35 psi, which is a little hard to accept, but it's what I did find from an official Kawasaki document. The superchargers on these bikes are so thermally efficient that they don't need an intercooler, allowing for space and weight savings. But what about the engine itself? Well, I should start by saying that the differences between the H2 and H2R are different camshafts, head gaskets, clutch, intake, exhaust, and ECU. Other differences include the rear sprocket and tires, just to mention. Downgrading these components and running a restricted tune for the road makes the bike way more streetable. Kawasaki designed the engine to handle up to 2 times greater stress than a naturally aspirated equivalent inline 4. As established, the H2R is the definitive bike of this family, and thus, despite the fact that the H2 is detuned, it's actually the same unit, like the same engine as the R version, and it can be souped up to reach essentially the same specs if you dare. The pistons are the anti-knock flat crown type, inspired by the so-called green gas engine developed by the gas and turbine and machinery wing of the whole company. Intake valves are stainless steel, but the exhaust valves are friction welded from an alloy known as Inconel and steel, with the former material being used for the valve head due to heat resistance on the exhaust side. The pistons are actually not forged, but they're cast. Kawasaki says that they offer better strength specifically at the high temperatures generated, and they use a specific process that can precisely remove material for ideal weight and strength on the pistons. The engine uses a dual injection system, meaning you have a set of injectors spraying fuel in the factory polished ports after the butterflies, and a set in the airbox spraying fuel at the intake funnels. This improves the air-fuel mixture and even helps cool the air before entering the intake through a misting effect. It also grants the ECU another layer of control when it comes to things like engine braking or traction control, for example. The exhaust ports are actually separated per valve in the same cylinder, and the coolant jacket around the cylinders extends a little into the casting in between them. Because both exhaust ports do not merge per cylinder, the hydroformed headers have to be in oval shape before they eventually become the more familiar round shape as they collect to the mid-pipe. And check out that radiator up front. Due to the lack of a lower fairing, it does a very good job of keeping this hot setup cool. Further cooling the engine are several oil jets for the supercharger and its gear system, the undersides of the pistons, the transmission. And because of the complex oiling system, fun fact, this thing actually holds 1.3 gallons of oil, or like 5 1/4 quarts. That's about as much as you put in a Chevy 350 small block. The transmission is the smoother dog ring type, where the gears remain in place and the dog rings, they slide around into position, as opposed to the standard of forks sliding the actual gears around. So how about the chassis? Well, as I stated before, Kawasaki was adamant about providing extreme high-speed stability, but also the ability to corner well on a racetrack. Because remember, you can make a ZX14 stable at top speed just through its sheer weight and size. The H2R is supposed to be the best of both worlds. So Kawasaki decided that instead of using a big bike wheelbase for high-speed stability, they would use aerodynamics. Keeping the wheelbase short would allow the bike to remain sharp and nimble. They used the trellis-style frame, which you would probably most associate with Ducati or KTM, because they claimed that it provided both the strength to harness the incredible power of the supercharged engine and the balanced flex to achieve stability for high-speed riding, right? So this bike is going to be ridden at 200 plus miles an hour. So they have to consider that. The trellis frame also tends to look a lot better than like the typical bulky twin spar frames. The problem is that manufacturers tend to not really integrate the twin spars into the design of the bike, so they just stick out as these flat black blobs. It'd be kind of cool to, throw some graphics on them or something, maybe like a removable panel. Anyway, by virtue of what Kawasaki needed from the frame, it is naturally not as stiff as those black blobs. The point is to be able to cope with disturbances that you may encounter north of 200 miles an hour, like a pothole. We've all seen the tank slapping clips. I've somewhat grown attached to this bike just based on all the painful research and the 30 plus tabs I currently have open. I've seen guys review this bike and say things like it's a little bit wobbly when fully gunning it out of a hard knee down corner, for instance. Like at the limits of the chassis, they notice that it's not that stiff. And maybe it's because I currently ride these crusty cobbled together customs of mine and see anything of this caliber as completely unflawed. It would offend me in some you don't even know the struggle way. But you know what? I understand now. The flex is actually engineered in, with different diameters, thickness, and bends of each pipe selected to obtain optimal stiffness and weight. The open nature of the steel trellis also offers advantages in cooling for the supercharged engine. The paint itself is actually pretty cool, and later models got this fancy self-healing paint that can effectively fill like light scratches. It's an interesting color because it looks chrome in some light, but like gunmetal in others. Overall, it just succeeds at looking premium. The dash is kind of dated by this point with all the TFT displays out now, which the H2 eventually got, but this is honestly fine because it has the best layout. Analog style tack, digital speedo, the way it should be. What else? You also got a single-sided, which is a first for Kawasaki, actually. And it allows for better aerodynamics because the exhaust can be mounted closer to the body. Suspension, which I find is always the boring part, so I'll make this quick. The H2 has a rake and trail of 24.5 degrees and 103 millimeters, while the R is 25.1 degrees and 108 millimeters, respectively. You get KYB 43mm adjustable forks with 120mm of travel and an adjustable rear shock. 17-inch wheels all around with either 190 or 200 width rear tire for the H2 and a 190 for the R, since you'll have to ride it on Bridgestone racing slicks. Those are like the only tires that Kawasaki approves for the R. 330mm discs with 4-piston Brembo teeth up front and a 250mm disc with a 2-piston out back. Of course, you get the whole slew of alphabet soup rider aids with, after all, this is a modern bike. When Kawasaki first revealed the prices of these bikes back in late 2014, you were talking 25 grand for the H2 and 50 grand for the H2R. But dealers were marking these all the way up, so yeah, right. The H2R comes with no warranty and is only available for pre-order on a first come first served basis every so often. Mind you, I've been talking about the original run of the H2 and the H2R this whole time. They made changes over the years and even introduced like special versions and 2 new models since then. But let's just stay in 2015 for a little bit longer. TikTok ain't exist for 1 more year, and even then it was contained in China. Corona didn't exist for 4 more years, and even then it was contained. I'm not doing this. I was happy, and the H2 was hitting showrooms, and people were kind of disappointed. Yeah, not everyone, but the problem is that when the H2 was revealed, because remember it was revealed after the H2R. People were confused as to why it just had to be 200 horsepower, and that's it, because in 2015, leader bikes were already making 200 horsepower. And you know what? I've been keeping that from you. I compared the H2R to the S1000RR earlier and said that it was 26 pounds heavier at 476 pounds, but obviously it has a whole 100 more horsepower. But I took care not to mention the H2's weight at all this whole time. A weight which is... Sorry, one more time? Which is 525 pounds wet, 75 pounds more than the S1000RR. See, the H2R is not a direct competitor to the S1000RR. The S is road legal and complies with all the laws and needs for that privilege. So why exactly is it that the H2 has such high weight with still competition comparable horsepower? Hell, even the ZX-10R at the time had 200 horse and it was 15% lighter. Well, the weight over the H2R comes from things like the turn signals, mirrors, not carbon fiber bodywork, headlights, catalytic converter, muffler, rear fender, some extra cowling, and extra wiring harness bits for all the lights and emission stuff. I think that's obvious, but when it comes to power, people tend to overlook torque, at least when it comes to high rev and inline 4 sport bikes. In order to understand why the road legal H2 isn't shortchanged, you can just compare the torque figures, okay? Like the S1000 peak torque is 113 newton meters or 83.3 pound-feet at 10,500 RPM. as I mentioned before. The Road H2 has 133.5 Newton meters, or 98.5 pound-feet, at 13,600 RPM. Torque was also delivered super hard way earlier than the S1000RR and delivered it all the way to redline where it peaked, which helped it, get to the top speed quickly and easily, so there's no drop-off. It just keeps going. I mean, to even get that on the low end, you have to start looking at 1200cc Panigales, twins to see numbers like that. And even on those, the torque tends to drop a few thousand RPM before a redline. I'm gonna get away from these figures because I keep confusing myself trying to differentiate between Craig and Wheelhouse figures to other bikes that I want to compare. But I want to say that I find that a lot of journalists stress the fact that the numbers don't tell the full story with the Road H2, and that the feeling that you get from riding this bike is like nothing else. Just like the H2 from the 70s, which, as you remember from earlier, was the mission statement for this bike.
Alright, this could be the star of EICMA 2014, the long-teased Kawasaki H2, the street bike. See the H2R over there? That's got 300 horsepower, somewhere around there. They're saying the H2, the street legal version, is about 200 horsepower. A little bit on the low side from what we're expecting, but the big power number is 98 pound-feet of torque, which is way more than anything else from a 1000cc sport bike.
It apparently applies to the nerfed version as well. I do believe that perhaps Kawasaki missed an opportunity by restricting the H2 so much, because face value really does mean a lot. It always does. Granted, maybe that's all they could do at the time and still comply with emissions, and granted, they gave the bikes a power boost, which I will get into in a second. And with all the research that tuning companies have done, paired with the fact that the engine is once again the same as the H2R's at its core, you can very easily throw an exhaust, intake, tune, and supercharge a gear kit to skyrocket the horsepower like well past 250, just like that. Bolt-on mods, they still apply here. Alright, so let's go over the updates, Escape from 2015, special editions, new models, as the years went on. In 2016, the road legal H2 and the H2R received a slipper clutch. In 2017, they both received an IMU.
Yes, IMU.
Which basically allows for lean angle sensitive ABS and traction control, meaning the bike can apply those features to different degrees based on whether or not you're in a turn, as well as getting the new standard Öhlins TTX shock. 2017 was actually a big year because that's also when the H2 Carbon was released, which is pretty much just an H2, but with carbon fiber used for the main upper fairing. Because remember, the H2R got the carbon bodywork, the H2 didn't. The paint was slightly more matte in texture, and you got this cute little serial number on a supercharger. Yeah, the carbon version is actually still sold today, and it's like $3,000 more than a normal one. But I imagine in the future, when these get more collectible, you're gonna get a premium for those. In 2018, Kawasaki kind of confused us by dropping a Sport Tourer version of the H2, the H2 SX. Naturally, the SX has a softer riding position and a slightly less powerful engine. That's always how it goes when you make something based on a sport bike. You reduce the top end power a little bit. In this case, it's 197 peak horsepower and lower the red line. But this is as compared to the updated H2 in 2019, which got 228 horsepower, which I'm skipping ahead by saying that, but I'll get back to that. You also boost the mid-range power for this use case. The H2 SX had launched alongside the H2 SX SE, and that one pretty much launched with all the electrical doodads that the H2 had, but it also came with a true TFT display for the 2018 model year, which the sport bikes had gotten for the 2019 model year. For the 2019 model year, the H2 SX SE was then updated to the H2 SX SE Plus. I blame Apple. Which saw the touring bike receive updated suspension, customizable ride modes, Brembo Stylema monoblock calipers, that fancy self-healing paint that I mentioned earlier, and the ability to control your bike from your phone. And just so I could put this bike to bed, for 2022, the H2 SX SE Plus dropped the plus from the name for some reason, and notably received Bosch's Advanced Rider Assist system, dubbed RS, pointing to what the safety system seeks to preserve, allowing for adaptive cruise control, forward collision warning, and blind spot detection. The system can apply throttle and brakes in the case of a vehicle, that is trying to follow, match the speed with. If they hit the brakes, this can slow down the bike. This is alongside a new 6-axis IMU.
Yes, IMU.
A few tweaks to the exhaust, transmission, cam timing, sees that the 2022 model improves performance-wise. Some quality of life updates like standard heated grips, wider seat, USB port, keyless go, sees that it improves touring-wise. And a truly awesome styling update sees that this bike arguably looks better than the sport bikes. That's subjective, but the reason I say that is it has no bad angles. And it doesn't look like the typical big-headed tourer. like the previous SX. Like it's a really solid looking design, whereas the sport bikes are very, very polarizing. You either love them or you hate them. Or you look at it from this angle, you love it. You look at it from that angle, you hate it. You know, they have some incredible angles and some really bad ones as far as the sport bikes go. Oh, speaking of the sport bikes, for 2019, the H2 and the H2R received a big update based on improvements gained from developing the H2SX. So you can actually thank that bike for the 228 horsepower the street H2 was bumped up to. They achieved this through new air filters, intake chambers, plugs, and ECUs. The H2R had 0 engine changes, but they both gained the Brembo stylomic calipers, that full TFT display with the Bluetooth, and the fancy self-healing paint. And fast forward to 2022, and that's really all I want to acknowledge. Alright, fine, if you say so, but I tried to get away from it.
Welcome to a wet Thunderhill Raceway for the track portion of our 1000cc naked bike shootout. And this next to me is the Kawasaki Z H2. Let's get right into 3 things I like and 3 things I don't like about the ZH2. So that said, let's get into 3 things I don't like about the ZH2. Third thing I don't like about the ZH2, it looks kinda funky. I mean, I don't mind it necessarily, but it's not my favorite looking bike in this test. But obviously looks are subjective, and I'm not the prettiest person in the world either, so there you go.
How long have I been waiting for this new Z now? When was it? 2014 the Gen 4 came out. The Gen 4 is such a nice, pretty bike. Was I disappointed or was I disappointed? Fucking gutted. Just the look of it. I mean, on the other hand, what? 100 pounds of torque, 200 bhp. Fucking hell, you'd die for that, wouldn't you? So yeah, motor brilliant, but fuck. Look at that new Ducati Street Fighter. More power. Hell of a lot less weight. It looks fucking good.
It's the day after the Tokyo Motor Show, after Kawasaki has released their brand new ZH2, and my god, what were they thinking?
Right, so the Z H2 was released for the 2020 model year. It is actually packing the H2 SX version of the engine, so it has the same extensive changes from the original H2 that I mentioned earlier that went onto the touring bike. That said, it makes the same 197 horsepower, which is a fair bit on a naked bike. The main source of comparison was always the Street Fighter V4, which is by no means a handsome bike, but compared to this thing, ZH2 weighed in at 526 pounds wet and featured less bodywork with a full handlebar, with a standard swing arm, cheaper brakes, and suspension, and a couple, missing touring features, obviously. Precisely because of all that, it was actually relatively affordable at $17,000 for that year. The ZH2 SE was released, but all that really did was put the expensive brakes and suspension back on it, the Öhlins and Brembo. I think I'm so harsh on the ZH2 because I very clearly remember just how disappointed I and many others were when they finally showed how this bike looked. I'm a naked bike boy, so this one hurt definitely, considering the Eurobike fans got these super awesome looking hyper naked bikes, Street Fighter V4, Tuono, and I mean, like the Street Fighter V4 is kinda ugly for a Ducati, which means it looks incredible against most other bikes, but was definitely not the best Ducati could do, because we know what Ducati can do. Still, with all that said, ZH2, obviously, incredible bike. I feel really smart after making this video, because like I stated at the very beginning, I kind of overlooked the technical aspects of this line of bikes just due to where I was in life. This is very much a bike worth understanding. The H2R is the fastest and most powerful production motorcycle in the world with its 326 horsepower. It hit an indicated 400 kilometers an hour or 250 miles an hour on the Osman Gazi Bridge in Turkey, the 4th longest bridge in the world, and it was able to hit that speed in 26 seconds. The H2R in 2014 was certainly a wonder of the world, and it's notable that it's still very much a wonder of the world 8 years on. Without a doubt, that bike and all of its derivatives are special, showing what's possible if a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate with passion and heritage decides to apply itself. You know, right in this conclusion, I thought about that old Honda ad that I showed in the turbobike video, for the one for the CX500, where he says, "The only thing about it that is not surprising is the name of the company that built it." When it comes to these H2 bikes, I definitely felt that one. Thanks for watching.